Hello and welcome to a Flappy Inky Feathers YouTube video. This is actually my first video, so we will see how this goes. Today I'm going to be talking about applying for ADP as an autistic adult. Okay, so first of all, it would help if I could move on the slide. Thought I should let you know who I actually am, why I have information that's worth listening to in this area. So my name's Flick. I am diagnosed autistic myself, and I'm also a mother to autistic children. Before sort of doing all of this, starting the Flappy Inky Feathers page and everything, I previously worked as the senior autism practitioner at an autistic-led autism charity. So I did lots of different training and webinars and things like that when I worked there. I'm also on the board for Autistic Pride Aberdeen at the moment. And like I said, I run the Flappy Inky Feathers Facebook page where I post about autism, but also writing and corvids as well. So hopefully we'll get a mix of videos up eventually. Okay, so today, focusing on ADP. What am I actually trying to do with this video? What am I hoping that you'll get from watching this video? Right, so I'm hoping to provide autistic relevant examples for each of the ADP sections. Okay, so that's adult disability payments. So when you're doing the application form, it's split into different sections, and it can be a bit tricky as an autistic adult knowing what sorts of things you should be writing in those sections, what's actually relevant, what they're going to care about. So I'm hoping to go through that today and to highlight sort of aids and adaptations that autistic people a lot of the time will already have in place, but not realize, because when we're living as autistic people in the world, we are just used to our own normal. So we won't necessarily realize what sorts of things we're doing to support ourselves that most other people are actually not having to do, not having to think about the sorts of things that we might already have in place that would be really relevant for filling in the form. I'm hoping to provide a bit of a vocabulary as well, the sorts of words, the sorts of terminology that is going to be effective for accurately filling in the form, but also explaining some of the support needs that you might have to whoever it is that's assessing the form, who may or may not have a really good knowledge of autism and everything that that can kind of bring along. So I'm not trying to, encourage anybody to lie on the form or anything. I'm genuinely kind of saying, look, here are some examples. Pick the ones that you know do apply to you. I'm not kind of trying to provide you with things you can claim that aren't actually a sort of truthful representation of your life. So first of all, what is ADP? When I'm talking about ADP throughout all of this, what on earth am I actually talking about? So it stands for Adult Disability Payments. So this is a Scottish thing, okay? So it's going to be relevant if you are an autistic adult living in Scotland. It's provided by Social Security Scotland, which is an agency of the Scottish government. And basically, it's extra money that you get every month if you have a long-term disability or health condition that affects your everyday life, essentially. It's the Scottish equivalent of PIP, which you might know if you live in the UK. So that's personal independence payments. So we did used to get PIP in Scotland rather than ADP. So ADP was launched in 2022. Now, ADP does tend to be a bit better to apply for than PIP. And the people who run it, the people who assess it, do also tend to be a bit better informed in my experience. So if you have previously applied for PIP back when that was a thing, and you haven't tried sort of reapplying since it's changed to ADP, that might be worth a go. Okay, first of all, before we're kind of looking at each section, I'll take it section by section. A few more things that I just wanted to say. First of all, there is no shame in needing more support than other people do. Really isn't. Especially because actually a lot of the time, the reason we need that support is because the world is not built for us, okay? It's often due to wider society, problems and barriers that we end up facing because of the fact that the world is not built for autistic people, and that can make our lives an awful lot harder than they need to be. So there's no shame in needing these supports, okay? It's absolutely fine. It doesn't make you less of a human being. It doesn't make you less worthy of general respect or love or anything at all, okay? So yeah, absolutely no shame in that. Also, it's worth kind of bearing in mind that you can add suspected conditions that you are not yet diagnosed with. And when they talk about conditions, unfortunately, that's the word they use for everything, for all kind of disabilities, for all neurodivergencies. I do not class autism as a condition myself, but in terms of the wording in the forms and things, that is how they're going to refer to it. But yeah, you can also add in sort of things that you might suspect that you already have. You know, a lot of autistic people have, for instance, complex PTSD. So that might be something, and especially if it's something that you have discussed with, for instance, a counselor, and they maybe haven't been qualified to diagnose you with it, but if it's something that you have discussed with a mental health care professional or something like that, you can pop it down and you can put that it's suspected. This is also good to know for if you're on a waiting list to be seen about something. You know, if you're waiting to be seen for an ADHD assessment, but you haven't yet actually made it, you know, to that point in the queue, again, you can include that in the list of conditions that they have at the beginning of the form. And when they talk about therapies as well, these can be things that you do for yourself to help at home. So for instance, when I filled in the form, I added about the fact that I do yoga quite regularly. And I do that because it helps me with my interoception. That's a word I'm going to use a few times throughout this. So your interoception is one of your senses. It's your sense of what's going on internally inside your body. So, you know, being aware of hunger, thirst, needing the toilet, pain, temperature variations, feeling queasy, things like that. That's all connected to your interoception. And yoga can help with some of that. It can help you to be a bit more aware of what's going on inside your body, if that's maybe something that normally you're not so aware of. It can also help with your proprioception, another word I'll be using a few times. That's your sense of where you are in space, where your body is in relation to other objects and to itself. Again, something that sometimes autistic people are maybe not quite as attuned to as other people maybe are. And yoga can also help with things like reducing anxiety, you know, and things like that. So I popped that down. So stuff like that, you know, if you go and get regular massages because you find that due to your sensory needs, you end up sitting in some weird and wonderful ways. You know, I'm sat right now with my legs up crossed on my computer chair, can never sit quote unquote normally, but sometimes this can mean that we end up with some aches and pains and things like that. So yeah, you know, anything like that that you are doing regularly, that you maybe weren't specifically prescribed, but that really does help with whatever, again, quote unquote condition it is that you're applying for, then that can be something that you can pop down. And you're really thinking about your worst days here, because I think a lot of autistic people, we mask heavily, yeah, and we maybe often sort of fawn quite a lot. So we try to downplay our own struggles for the benefit of the people around us, to stop them from feeling uncomfortable about the fact that maybe we've got those different needs that they don't have. This is not the place to be doing that, okay? You're not trying to downplay everything that you might be doing to try and help yourself, all of the struggles that you might be having, okay? This is not when you should be doing that. In this form, you're thinking about those days when actually everything does become too much. Those days where you've had two meltdowns and you get to the end of the day and you're just curled in a ball in the corner, you know? And so it can be crap. Yeah, it can be pretty rubbish filling in this form. You're probably going to want to break it up a bit, not do it all in one go. It's long. And also maybe think about some self-care as well for the days when you are going to be filling it in, to maybe make yourself feel a bit better afterwards, okay? So thinking about the sorts of language that you're going to be wanting to use in this form, because they can be quite specific, okay, with the language that's going to tick their boxes for what does and does not get you points in each of the sections. Prompts, okay, so prompts are when you could really do with somebody else prompting you, telling you that you need to be doing something. An aid is something that you use to help support yourself. An adaptation is something that some sort of change that you've made to your surroundings, to your living environment, again, to kind of help you and your support needs. You talk about the support that you do need, but also talk about any distress that certain things might bring you, okay? So you don't want to just be saying, oh, it makes me feel a bit rubbish. Talk about how it distresses you, because this is language that they're going to specifically be looking for. And also think about times when these different needs that you have make you vulnerable as well, okay? So think as you're going through, could I be using one of these words in what I'm trying to explain here? Also, you can add examples from your past to illustrate, which is, you know, we're good at that. We're good at that as autistic people a lot of the time. That's often how we empathize, right? You know, sort of bring out, oh, here's an example from earlier in my life. So you can absolutely pop those in if you don't feel like you've done a good enough job of explaining something. You can use an example to illustrate it. So, for instance, when thinking about the planning and journey section, I did talk about a time that I had a meltdown because there was a diversion when I was trying to drive to the vets. So yeah, sort of thinking about that if you've got examples as well that you can pop in. And consider common co-occurring neurodivergencies, conditions, disabilities, you know, just in case there are things that you've missed that, again, before you start filling in the form, you might want to go to your GP and ask if you can have a referral to be assessed. And then that's something that you can pop in the form again as well. Okay, so on to our first section on the ADP form, preparing and cooking food. I might be moving my face around the screen a little bit to actually be able to see this. I maybe should have thought about that when I was creating the PowerPoint, but this is my first YouTube video, so cut me a bit of slack. Okay, so when you're preparing and cooking food, some things to consider when you're filling in that section. So you're interoception. Again, we went over that, those internal body signals, okay? And as autistic people, we do have different experiences of our sensory needs. We won't necessarily recognize sensory input in the same way that other people do. We might be kind of we might not react, kind of, because we're reacting appropriately to what we're experiencing. But we might be more aware of certain sensory stimuli. We might find it more distressing than other people. We might be less aware of other sensory stimuli, or we might find certain sensory stimuli much more pleasurable than other people. There's a big kind of mix in there. But when that comes to our interoception, do you always know when you're hungry? I don't, you know, I sometimes feel like, oh, the entire world is ending, everything is awful. Why do I even carry on? I feel terrible. I think that we're all doomed. And then maybe my husband will ask me if I've remembered to have lunch. And I realize, oh, the world's maybe not ending. I just need a sandwich, actually. So yeah, can you even remember that you need to eat? Or are there days when you forget about breakfast and lunch, and you know, then wonder why you've got a terrible headache when it gets to dinner? Or on the flip side, do you maybe not notice when you're full, actually? So yeah, thinking about that, thinking about whether you need those prompts. Again, it's those sort of words that you need to be thinking about there. So yeah, I sometimes need prompting to know when I am hungry, prompting to remember to drink fluids and things like that. Your proprioception, again, that sense of where you are in the world in relation to things around you. Does that mean that you're at risk when you're preparing and cooking food? When you're chopping up vegetables, yeah? You ever catch your fingers when you're doing that? It's bread for me. It's when I'm cutting bread, the number of times it's just on my thumb there. I just sort of catch the edge of my thumb with the bread knife. That's a big one for me. So yeah, thinking about that. Do you have issues around being aware of exactly where your fingers end and the knife begins and not catching yourself? You know, peeling things. Do you ever end up peeling your own skin occasionally? Grating. Carrying hot pots of food around. So yeah, think about whether or not those things for you are maybe a bit more of a hazard than they would be for other people. Then think about your executive functioning as well. So executive functioning is our ability to recognize that something needs to be done, figure out all the different steps required to do the thing, do all of those steps in order, in a timely fashion, and complete the actual task at the end as well. So for instance, do you have all the right ingredients for the meal that you need to make? Or do you quite often start cooking a meal, go to the cupboard and realize, oh, I'm missing half of the things I needed for this meal? I did this recently, actually, just a couple of days ago. I started to make stir fry, and that was brilliant. And then when I went to get the noodles out, we didn't have any noodles, so that was a bit of a problem. And given that sometimes we can really struggle with changing track. We've got those monotropic brains. That can actually cause a lot of distress when you get partway into cooking a meal and suddenly realize you can't continue because you don't have all the ingredients. So can you actually follow a recipe or a meal plan or whatever without skipping important steps? You're forgetting to put flour in when you're baking something, that would be a big one. Or getting distracted partway through. If you have the oven on or you've got something kind of boiling on the stove, do you ever wander off and forget about it? And then suddenly the smoke detector's going off because you've got, a burning pot there with potatoes or something that have boiled dry. Do you need convenience food as well? Because, that's an extra expense if you do, like, for instance, pre-chopped vegetables, because you can't actually trust yourself to be cutting them up without cutting your fingers, or garlic in a squeezy tube because you can't deal with the sensory aspect of actually crushing garlic bulbs or not the whole bulb, cloves. That's the one. What about your executive functioning around actually making sure that all of the food is prepared? Do you need to buy in, for instance, frozen mashed potatoes because all the steps of actually having to chop the potatoes up and peel them and then boil them and then mash them with some butter, or that's just too many steps and you can't do all of that whilst also having to prepare whatever it is you're having with the mashed potatoes. So yeah, think about whether or not you tend to buy in a lot of convenience food because actually you're not really able to go through all of the steps required to prep the food if you're doing it all from scratch. Does cooking a meal take you longer than it would other people? Because a lot of us, when we're asked, can you, cook a meal? The answer will be yes, because technically we can, and we answer these things literally, right? But the answer might be, well, yes, but it's a meal that would take someone else half an hour to make, and it takes me 2 hours because of a lot of the stuff I've already gone over, For me, when I'm chopping vegetables, I'm chopping them so much more exactly than other people are, If I'm chopping something finely, then my finely and someone else's finely are really just not comparable at all. But it does mean that it takes me so much longer to chop something finely than it would your kind of average person off the street. So yeah, between the executive functioning stuff, between the fact that I have to do it all so perfectly, that I have to be quite careful with how I'm chopping things because otherwise I am liable to catch myself with the sharp knife and things. It ends up taking me so much longer to make a relatively simple meal than I think it would your kind of average person. So yes, I can do it, but it's not just immediately answering these questions. Yeah, well, yeah, technically I can. Right, okay, but does it take you more effort? Does it take you more time? And are you so exhausted then by the time you finish cooking that you can't actually eat? Back when I was an autism practitioner, this is something that I heard a lot when speaking to service users, was that they would say that yes, they could technically cook a meal, but it would take them so much concentration, it would cost them so much in terms of energy to do it, that by the time they were done, they couldn't face eating the food that they had made. Now, obviously, that's a massive problem, isn't it? And it kind of negates the entire point of the cooking and the preparing food in the first place. So that's definitely worth considering. So those are just some of the things that you should be thinking about when you're filling in that preparing and cooking food section. Okay, on to taking nutrition. So first of all, do you have restrictions or specific sensory needs around what you eat? Quite often, and this is a bit of a generalization, so don't worry if you don't fall into one of these two camps, but quite often us autistic people will kind of be at one end or the other of a spectrum of at one end kind of actually really struggling with a lot of textures, a lot of flavors, a lot of smells, and maybe having quite a restricted diet, perhaps sort of sticking to a lot of bland, safe foods. Sometimes we jokingly call that vegetarian. I've heard that used before. But then at the other end, you know, some autistic people want all the flavors and all the textures and all the smells because they're really sensory seeking when it comes to food. So yeah, sort of thinking about that, thinking about your needs around food when it comes to those sensory aspects. Does that actually make a difference to the sorts of things that you are able to eat? And again, do you realize when you're hungry, when you're thirsty? Is this something that you're actually aware of? Is it something that you are already putting into place, aids and supports to help yourself? Do you have alarms on your phone to remind you that it's actually time to eat because otherwise you wouldn't remember? Do you need prompts from people around you? So those sorts of things can be quite important to think about as well. And if you have meal times integrated into your normal routine, what happens when that routine changes? You know, if the only reason that you do remember about food is because, well, yeah, but when I get up in the morning, I have breakfast as soon as I get up. And then, you know, well, I have lunch when it's my break at work, and I have dinner when I'm, you know, after I've cooked dinner for the kids when they get home from school or something like that. Well, what if you're later up, you know, for in the morning? What if you're on holiday from work? What if the kids are away seeing their grandparents? You know, what if there's a change to your normal routine? Do you still remember to eat? Or do you actually need that routine to be in place and intact to give you that reminder that you need to be having meals? Going back to your proprioception, do you often spill drinks, you know, drop food, things like this? I tend to avoid buying white clothing because it will end up stained. It's yeah, it's a bit of a pain, but I do tend to drop a lot of food and drink and things on myself because that proprioception just means that sometimes I miss my mouth, sometimes I miss the table that I'm supposed to be putting something down on, you know, sometimes crumbs just seem to be attracted to my tops. I don't know. And also think about whether this actually means that you end up having to pay out. You know, I may or may not have damaged one or more laptops by spilling tea and things on them. So yeah, thinking about that, is that ever an issue for you as well? Do you have a specific way that you need to eat? You know, perhaps an order that you need to eat your food in, certain containers that you need to eat your food out of, things like this that kind of end up making it a bit more restricted for you, and which maybe mean as well that you might take a bit longer to eat your meals than other people do. It is quite common for autistic people, again, because we're often kind of at one extreme or another. I know some autistic people who wolf down meals and it's gone in a blink of an eye, and other autistic people who are sat there, you know, 2 hours after they've been given food and they're still sort of picking at it. So thinking about that as well. Thinking about the environment you're in and how that affects you eating. If you are somewhere where other people are eating, Is that an issue for you? Do you need to eat in a separate room, perhaps because of the smell of their food, and the fact that if you can smell their food, that stops you from being able to eat your own food? Or maybe if you can hear them chewing, that can be a big one for lots of us. And does that mean that it's more difficult for you to eat in crowded places, to be eating when you're out and about, to be eating in a work environment, things like this? But even just at home with your family as well, do you need to actually take yourself away and eat elsewhere? And thinking about how maybe your general sort of state of mind and how you're feeling, how emotionally regulated you are that day might play a part as well in that. Okay, so managing therapies, or managing health conditions, or monitoring, sorry, health conditions is the next section in the form. So, does your executive functioning affect how often you remember about, the therapies that you have or taking medications and things? It might be that you already have prompts or supports or aids in place for these things. So, do you need an alarm or a prompt to remember to go to your therapy, to take your medication? Do you need to have a pillbox with the days marked on each week in order to help you to remember? Thinking about these things, thinking about whether you already have something in place. Also think about whether there are difficulties caused by sensory needs around therapy or taking medications as well. So that might be things like not noticing due to your interoceptive differences. So yeah, you sort of don't even realize that you need to do the thing because you haven't noticed that you're feeling bad. You haven't noticed that you need to take your meds because actually your pain responses are not the same as other people's. And instead of really noticing that pain physically, you just sort of start to feel a bit grumpy when you're in pain instead, and you're not really processing it in the same way that somebody else would. Maybe you really struggle to swallow tablets, and that's a big issue for you when it comes to taking meds. And that might mean as well that instead of taking tablets, you have to have your medication prescribed in a liquid form as well. Things like that, that's worth kind of noting down. Perhaps you find certain therapies really uncomfortable, actually. Might even be that you've stopped attending certain therapies because you have found them really uncomfortable. Perhaps when it comes to your emotional regulation, might be because the therapist or the mental health professional you were seeing didn't really understand about autism, so they weren't adapting the therapy appropriately for your needs. It might be that from a sensory point of view, you really struggled and it was distressing for you, or that you're still going to those therapies, but that they do cause you to become a lot more tired than other people would with the same therapies. It's worth thinking about. Okay, washing and bathing as well. So when it comes to washing and bathing, do you forget about the fact that you need to do that that whole hygiene thing? Perhaps because of executive functioning differences, meaning that it's just not something that you ever really remember about. When you do remember, it's too late at night, you should already be in bed, or it's when you already need to leave the house, and you don't have time, and yeah, you could really do with somebody else actually prompting you to go and wash and bathe or whatever it is. Or maybe you need aids or adaptations due to those proprioceptive or vestibular. It's not a word we've used yet. So again, this is another sensory thing. In school, they tell you you've got 5 senses. That's absolute rubbish. So your vestibular sense is essentially your sense of balance, okay? That's connected to kind of moving around in space, keeping upright, your sense of where you are and keeping sort of stabilized. So for instance, maybe you really need sort of non-slip stickers down on your bath, or you need a grab rail or something, because actually you get a bit dizzy when you're getting in and out of the bath or the shower or whatever due to those proprioceptive and vestibular differences. So that would be an aid or adaptation that you already have, that you're already using. That's worth mentioning. Do you struggle with washing or bathing due to sensory overwhelm? There's a lot that goes on sensory wise when it comes to dealing with all this hygiene stuff. You've got like the smell of all of the shampoos and bubble baths and all of the different products that you might be using. You've got the feel of the water on you, either kind of getting into it in the bath or it hitting you from above when you're having a shower. Some autistic people even feel that as pain. It's sore for them to be hit by the water from a shower. Others find it too tickly. Yeah. So yeah, is that an issue for you? Maybe the foaming of the shower gel or whatever it is also really uncomfortable for you. So that's worth really thinking about too. Perhaps you just get overwhelmed by all the transitions that are involved with washing and bathing. So, you've got the transition of the temperature change when you go into the bathroom, because bathrooms are almost always a different temperature from the rest of the house, right? Maybe it's just our house, but I feel like that's quite often the case. But then again, when you get undressed, that's a transition as well. Actually stepping into the shower or the bath, that's another transition. Each step that you need to do in terms of washing, putting on the shampoo, conditioner, or whatever, are sort of small transitions. Getting back out of the bath or shower afterwards into, again, the air, and getting out of the water, that's another. It's just full. There's just so many transitions involved. And for us with our monotropic brains, that can actually be really difficult to deal with. There can be a lot involved with washing and bathing. It can seem very simple from an outside perspective, but actually that can be incredibly difficult for a lot of us. So if that's you, don't worry, very normal, but worth getting that all down in the form. Maybe you take longer than most people as well, because you need time after all those transitions, after all of that sensory input that you've gone through. Do you then need to just sort of sit, on the edge of the bath, or on the bath mat on the floor, on the toilet lid or whatever, and just process it for a while? That's not uncommon for us need to sit and process afterwards. Do you need to spend more money on products as well, for sensory reasons, because you need to get specific branded items that need to be consistent every time, because you need to get something that's non-foaming, because you need to get something that's unscented, because, whatever it is, are you having to sort of spend more money than other people would on specific items due to your sensory needs because you're autistic? Okay, managing toilet needs or incontinence. Do you ever not notice that you need the loo until, maybe it's suddenly you're desperate? Maybe you've been sat and you've been absorbed in doing something for a while, special interests, again, monotropic brains. We can get really absorbed in what we're doing and not notice a lot of those sensory needs, a lot of those interoceptive kind of signals. We miss those. So perhaps you get up from doing that, and that's when it suddenly hits you and you need to run. You need to get to the toilet now. So you'd actually benefit from prompting, from having some support to remember that going to the toilet is something that you need to be doing relatively regularly. Perhaps you struggle actually when it comes to getting, your trousers or whatever undone because of your proprioceptive differences, meaning that things like buttons, things like flies, all of that are actually a bit fiddly for you, and that can make it difficult. It can maybe mean that you need to buy specific kinds of clothing just so that you can actually get everything sorted in time for you to make it to the toilet. Or it might mean that, yeah, it takes you a bit longer. It might mean that sometimes you have accidents if you are needing to run and then suddenly, oh no, I can't manage the fly quick enough. Perhaps you've got aids or adaptations in place already as well. Like I know some autistic people who always wear panty liners. It's just in case of these accidents, in case they do get absorbed and they don't notice until last minute. And as they're running there, some's kind of coming out already. Or perhaps you've got a potty next to your bed, because at nighttime you might again not really realize that you need to go until you're desperate and you're not going to make it, especially if your bathroom's other end of the house or something like that. So, or maybe you're got in a house share environment and you're too embarrassed about going to the toilet in the middle of the night because of high levels of anxiety around other people hearing you or something like this. So it might be that you've already got aids or adaptations in place as well. Okay, dressing and undressing a bit more generally. Do you struggle to get dressed or undressed due to those proprioceptive differences that we've already talked about? So perhaps, again, you do struggle with zips or laces or buttons or something. I know that I have I put those elasticated laces on my shoes that you just have to put on, lace them up once, make sure that they're the right length, and then it turns the shoes into slip-on or off ones instead of having to actually do up the laces every time. I can do laces, I can, but that's just one way in which I make my life a bit easier for myself. So yeah, thinking about that, thinking about whether you buy in really specific clothing because you know that, oh, I just can't really be dealing with zips or buttons or whatever it is. Maybe you need prompting to get dressed or undressed, again, due to those executive functioning differences. Or maybe you're experiencing a period of autistic burnout at the moment, and actually you're just not going to be getting dressed unless somebody else actually tells you that that's something you need to be doing. So yeah, sort of thinking about that. Is it something that you do automatically every day, or is it something that really you could do with having someone prompt you about? Do you struggle to choose appropriate clothing due to not knowing what your sensory needs will be over the course of a day, or perhaps not knowing what the weather forecast actually means in terms of how many layers you should wear, what thickness of fabric and things? I always check the weather forecast, or if I remember, due to executive functioning differences, if I remember, I check the weather forecast before I get dressed every day. But I don't always really know, because one day it can say a temperature and that means that I'll be comfortable in short sleeve t-shirt and trousers, but the next day it can say the same temperature and I've not factored in, the level of wind that day, or the fact that it's going to rain that day and it didn't the day before or something. And so clothing I was wearing the previous day actually isn't going to work. And it might be that you've got quite specific needs in terms of that clothing and everything, and it can be difficult to plan at the beginning of a day what you're going to be wearing so that it's going to be appropriate throughout all the activities you're doing that day, across the weather that you're likely to experience, all of this. So do you struggle when you need to get dressed in the morning with actually picking out clothes? And does it take you longer than it would take other people for those kind of reasons? And then connected to that, do you often need to change during the day because either the clothes are no longer meeting your sensory needs? Sometimes I get up in the morning and I'm feeling one way and I put on, I don't know, say a top with a polo neck top or something, because I'm feeling a bit chilly and I want something that's going to be really nice and snug and cozy and keep me warm, and that's a good option. But partway through the day, my sensory needs might change, and suddenly that same polo neck top is now actually making me feel like I'm being strangled, and I can't wear it anymore, and I have to change into a looser necked top, or something like that, maybe a sort of vest style top instead. So yeah, do you need to often change partway through the day? Again, maybe because you had not considered the weather, the clothes that you're wearing. Suddenly you realize, I'm too cold, I'm too hot, or yeah, these trousers are dragging along the ground and it's raining today and I didn't think about that, and now I have water kind of seeping up my legs, something along those lines. Continuing with this one, because it was a bit of a long one, and thinking about that temperature and weather and things, Personally, I have a really narrow band of temperature at which I'm comfortable, which is quite common for autistic people. So that means that, again, if the temperature changes much throughout the day or just my own kind of needs, then something that was totally fine in the morning can suddenly have me a horrible, hot, sweaty mess in the afternoon, or might leave me all shivery and cold and goosebumpy. So quite common for me to need to change what I'm wearing partway through a day because the clothes that I picked out in the morning no longer working for me. Do you need support to accurately figure out what's appropriate to wear for certain occasions as well? Quite common for us to get a bit anxious because we're going to be going to a wedding or a job interview or something that we don't normally go along to, and we're not quite sure what it is expected of us that we wear. And it might be that we really could benefit from getting advice from other people, and that, yeah, we could actually do with some support. I know that at previous jobs that I've had, for instance, when we've maybe had an event that we're doing, I've been messaging other people, colleagues that I work with ahead of time to see what they're going to be wearing, to try and gauge what I should be wearing. Oh, is this one where just sort of trousers and a casual top is going to be okay? Should I be wearing a dress? What kind of footwear is going to be expected here? Is there a dress code if you're going out for a meal somewhere? Things like this, that can be quite stressful for us. So if you find that either you're often asking other people what you should wear, or if you maybe would like to be asking, you don't have people you can ask, again, remember that that's something you can pop in, aids and supports and things that you would benefit from having, but you don't currently actually have in place. You can put those into the form. Do you struggle with the transitions involved in getting dressed or undressed as well? So again, it's quite common for me to take a bit longer getting dressed in the morning than maybe somebody else would. On some days, it can involve a lot of sitting, sitting on my bed, looking at clothes, sitting on my bed after I've got dressed for a while. So it just takes that bit longer than it would for other people, and a lot of that can be connected to those transitions that are involved. And yeah, sometimes that can lead to feeling dysregulated, potentially distressed by the time you've actually got dressed, with all of the planning it's involved, with the having to check weather, with the transitions, with the maybe trying on an outfit and then realizing, no, this is not working with my sensory needs today. I need to get changed and try something else. Or maybe you had an outfit in mind that you wanted to wear, but due to those executive functioning differences, you suddenly realize, oh, that's in the wash. Yeah, no, that's sitting in the washing machine, and I was supposed to put it in the tumble dryer yesterday, and I didn't. And anything along those lines. Okay, now we're on to communicating, which again, big one for autistic people, because we're not poor communicators. Being autistic does not automatically mean that you have bad communication skills. That is a myth. What it does mean, however, is we do have a different communication style, which can often be misinterpreted by non-autistic people. And we can often end up misinterpreting them because those two styles don't always gel very well, especially when people don't realize that we are using a different communication style. So, do you feel vulnerable because your autistic communication style is often misunderstood? Or perhaps you're often misinterpreting other people. And that it can leave us feeling very vulnerable for quite a lot of reasons. For one thing, it can mean that we, end up accidentally flirting with other people, or at least from their perspective, which can lead us to be very, very vulnerable, actually, in certain situations when that wasn't what we intended at all. Or perhaps that, yeah, other people can think that we're being hostile when we're really not. Perhaps we're just confused, So yeah, and anything like that. Do you often get these misunderstandings happening? And does that leave you feeling vulnerable? Do people ever change the way that they actually communicate with you, once they learn that you are autistic? You know, I've had people who have suddenly started to slow down their speech when they find out I'm autistic. And not only is that quite insulting and ignorant, but it actually makes it so much harder for me to understand people. Naturally, I have quite a fast speaking pace. I'm trying to slow it down a bit for this video so that everyone can catch everything I'm saying. But yeah, I find really slow speech really difficult to process personally. And so that makes it much more difficult for me to follow what somebody is saying. Other times as well, they'll start to kind of simplify the vocabulary once they learn that you're autistic as well. So yeah, sometimes the fact that they will change the way that they're communicating once they learn that about you can leave you feeling distressed. It can leave you feeling vulnerable. It can make it more difficult for you to actually understand what's going on as well. Perhaps as well, you might feel vulnerable because you're unsure how much information you're supposed to be sharing. It's very common for us. So we can kind of go one of two ways at that point a lot of the time. Sometimes we overshare, and that can leave us really vulnerable, actually, giving information that it maybe wasn't really safe or appropriate, quote unquote appropriate to give. But we didn't know, and we didn't want to lie. I often feel like if if there's information that's relevant in a situation for me to share and I don't share it, even though intellectually I know that that's totally fine, it can instinctively make me feel like I'm lying. So I do end up oversharing a lot because I don't like lying. That makes me feel really uncomfortable. But that can make me actually quite vulnerable. Or the other direction you can go in is that you undershare, and then you can be seen as hostile or difficult. You know, people can think that you're being awkward on purpose as well, and that can sometimes make people quite aggressive, actually. So yeah, not knowing how much information is expected from us, that can be a really big one. So think about, do people ever get irritated? Do they get even aggressive with you when you're communicating? And sometimes you don't even know why. You know, sometimes this is just a thing that seems to happen with people where they get really annoyed with you and you don't know. You don't know what you've done. You're not sure what it is that's actually happened or gone wrong. It's just that clash of communication styles. Do you ever talk too loudly as well, or too quietly without even realizing it? I have quite a loud voice a lot of the time, and when I'm enthusiastic about a topic, my volume starts to go up and up and up. And I have often throughout my life been told to, okay, shh, quieten down, all right. And again, in some environments, this might be seen as being rude, and it could leave me a bit vulnerable as well. Really, really big one for some autistic people is situational mutism. This is something that sometimes gets called selective mutism. Really not a very accurate term. It's very much a misnomer because we're not selecting that we're going to become mute at any given time. Tends to be the situation that we're in, how regulated we are, what else has happened that day, whether we feel like we're in a safe place and with safe people. Those are what's actually dictating whether or not we're able to use mouth speak, whether we're able to actually use that spoken communication. So yeah, if you do sometimes find that your words just kind of get stuck in your head and they're still all there, but you can't push them out of your mouth, that is very common for autistic people. But again, it can leave us very, very vulnerable. So what kind of reactions have you had if this has happened? Again, people can think you're being rude sometimes, and that can get them, you know, a bit aggressive and kind of annoyed, things like that. It can mean that you get dismissed as well. It can mean that you are left unable to advocate for your needs, which can mean that you end up in really, really distressing and or unsafe situations as well. So that can be a really, really big one for a lot of us. And do you use any aids for this. So, I'm thinking about things like, do you have communication cards that you take with you when you go out places? Do you use the sunflower lanyard when you go out shopping or when you're traveling or things like that to signify to staff that you might need a bit more space or a little bit more support or a bit more time, things like this? Do you have perhaps an app on your phone that you use that allows you to communicate with people when you're experiencing that situational mutism? So thinking about that, thinking about the things that you have put into place to help you with that communication, that's really important for this section of the form. Okay, now we're on to reading and understanding signs, symbols, and words. So, does your autistic communication style mean you sometimes misunderstand written text? Again, being autistic doesn't make you, stupid or make you a poor communicator, but we do often take things quite literally in terms of we have a very direct communication style. So we will typically say what we mean and mean what we say. Non-autistic people do not necessarily use language in that way. And that can mean that when we're filling in a form or we're reading, things, we can actually misunderstand what's written there because we're assuming that other people are communicating as directly as we are, but they're not. I often find that written communication seems unclear to me because I can interpret it in a whole heap of different ways, and I'm not sure which way it is that it's been meant, and that can make it very difficult for me. It can mean that I need to check with somebody else, what something means because I'm not 100% sure. So yeah, it can be really tricky because people are not very clear a lot of the time, to be honest. Do you ever ask other people at work or in your personal life to read messages or emails or signs or forms or whatever to ensure that you have interpreted them correctly? Because I definitely do. Although annoyingly for me, the vast majority of the people that I actually know are also autistic. So sometimes the response I get is, well, I don't know. But yes, I do ask a lot. Do you struggle to interpret? Yeah, questions on forms in particular, I find can be really, really unclear. And yes, that is part of the reason that I am doing this video in the first place is because it can be very difficult for us to know what we're actually supposed to be writing in response to questions on forms. But it's also a problem when I'm navigating websites, for instance, because it can be really unclear what certain things are supposed to mean, and how I would interpret something is not necessarily how the majority of other people would. Do you ever ask other people to read over stuff that you've written as well? So, emails, text messages, your responses on forms, things like that. Do you like to kind of get someone else's eyes on it first because you've had poor experiences in the past with people thinking that you're being too terse, people, assuming that you're being sarcastic, or aggressive, or standoffish, or all of these lovely terms that we get leveled at us so often. So yeah, and remember as well, if you don't have anybody to run this stuff past, but you would benefit from it, and if you did have it, then you definitely would, you can still put that in the form. The fact that you don't have access to supports doesn't mean that you can't write it in the form if you would benefit from that, if you actually did have access to it. Okay, now we're on to engaging socially with other people face to face. So, do you ever feel vulnerable when you're out and about, perhaps due to the fact that you need to stim? Okay, because stimming in public sometimes doesn't go down well. Where I'm relatively lucky living in where I do, in the world and in the country, because I can generally openly stim out and about without fear of physical harm. But I might still be judged, socially by people. Now I care less and less about that as I get older, but that doesn't mean that it's not something that I'm still facing, a barrier to kind of going out and about and engaging socially with people. Do you feel that you're oh, and for anybody who doesn't know what stimming is, actually, as a quick note as well, it's short for self-stimulatory behavior. I have been stimming here whilst actually presenting this video, using a sort of stim tool or toy that I've got here, but it's any way in which you are stimulating a certain sense in a repetitive way. All right. And autistic people, we tend to find that we get a lot of good regulation from doing that. So if you like to flap your hands, if you like to sort of tap, if you like to jiggle your leg, things like this. There are other ways to stim as well, but thinking about the sorts of ways that might actually end up with you being stigmatized whilst you're out and about. Some of those ones are going to be the more obvious ones, but also things like humming to yourself or maybe singing to yourself as well, sort of watching certain things that you find visually very pleasing. Yeah, a lot of this stuff that really helps us to regulate, but that other people might think makes us appear quote unquote weird, and they might judge us for it. And again, it might leave us feeling vulnerable, and it might put us off actually socializing with people as well. Do you feel that you're more vulnerable to people taking advantage due to you taking things at face value as well? Quite often we get called naive as autistic people, and again, we might not recognize people are flirting with us, because we might just think that they're being friendly. Oh, isn't that lovely? This person is really listening to me talk about this special interest. Isn't that really great? They must share that special interest. Woo! And actually what they think is happening is that you're flirting with them, and that can leave you vulnerable. Or yeah, perhaps they just get annoyed with you, as well. So yeah, there are various ways in which we might end up a bit more vulnerable, because of taking things at face value. Do you ever feel vulnerable when out and about due to your different communication style as well? You know, people might think that you're rude when you're actually not. You're just being clear and direct because that's your communication style. People might think that you're taking the piss as well, you know, often think that you're maybe taking the mick. It might be, for instance, a lot of autistic people, without meaning to, will mimic the accent of the person that they're talking to. It's not one that I do personally. I am terrible at even recognizing what accent somebody has, and I'm certainly not not good at emulating accents. But a lot of autistic people, a lot of them do. They start kind of mirroring it back, mirroring body language and things like that. And it's not something they're even aware of the fact that they're doing, or maybe they are aware of it, but they can't stop it. And other people will just think that they're taking the mick, and that's really not the case. It's all sort of linked into masking and fawning, and these sorts of responses actually. Might be that we get called arrogant as well for our communication style. That's quite a common one too. You know, maybe that's because you've been info dumping a little bit about a special interest or something. So yeah, we can come across a lot of problems, due to that communication style when we're trying to engage socially with other people, and that can leave us vulnerable sometimes. Do you ever worry as well that people might be annoyed because you avoid eye contact? Or flip side, perhaps you're the kind of autistic person who makes a lot of eye contact, potentially because as a child you didn't make eye contact and everybody was constantly hassling you to make more eye contact. Look at me in the eye when I'm talking to you, you know, because yeah, people can be obsessed with you staring at their eyeballs, and somehow that changes whether or not you can hear with your ears, apparently. But yeah, people can get really funny about that if you're making too much, quote unquote, or too little, quote unquote. eye contact. People can think that you're being rude. They can think that you're not interested in what they're talking about. Again, they can think that you're flirting with them if you're making a lot of eye contact, maybe, or that you're trying to start a fight, that you're actually, being aggressive towards them as well. So that can leave you quite vulnerable as well. And perhaps in general, you struggle to interpret non-verbal communication, potentially because you're not making that eye contact, you're maybe not looking at the other person, so you're missing some of those non-verbal cues as well. And that way you are maybe unaware of when somebody else is starting to get impatient with you, when they are trying to hint at certain things, rather than just coming out and outright saying it. So yeah, do you ever feel vulnerable because of these things? And then also, do you ever hit crisis points when you're out at social events? So what I mean by autistic crisis points is your meltdowns, your shutdowns, your elopement, okay? So essentially your fight, flight, freeze responses. Just as autistic people, we tend to be pushed into feeling those much more than your average person, essentially. So yeah, do you ever kind of find that you end up so dysregulated when you're out because maybe of some of these miscommunications, because of the sensory aspects of being out and about, because of all the transitions involved, all of these things? Do you find that you have those meltdowns, and or that you're worried that you're going to, that you have shutdowns, that you end up just leaving really abruptly, you elope, you sort of head off without letting anybody know, and then you get home to a dozen messages from people asking if you're okay and where you are and what happened. So all of that is worth thinking about. Okay, now we're on to making budgeting decisions. Do you have problems with paying bills on time due to those executive functioning differences that we might have? You might have all the best intentions, but then you just forget because something else has happened, or you thought you'd already paid it and oh no, wait, it turns out that was last month, or you started to pay it, but then there was a problem with the website loading and then you forgot to go back to it again, or whatever it is. And so actually you find that you're often kind of late paying for things that you're supposed to because you've forgotten about it. Maybe you struggle with ways that you're supposed to pay for things, or the ways that you're supposed to engage with banks and companies and the like, maybe ones that kind of deal with amenities, uh, things like this. Do they insist on phone calls? And actually, phone calls are really not accessible for you. Do they insist on in-person appointments? And actually, again, due to sensory aspects or whatever, getting out of the house that week wasn't an option for you. Do they insist that you use a specific app that just leads you to meltdown every time you try to use it? I hate apps. Something like that. And sort of thinking about those first couple of points there as well. Has this ever affected your credit rating? Has this actually had long-term impacts on your finances and sort of managing budgets and things like that? Do you struggle to budget due to executive functioning as well? Maybe you do remember to pay the monthly bills, or you've got your direct debits, your standing orders, whatever set up. And so that's not really an issue, but you forget to kind of factor in the one-off expenses like your annual insurance that comes round. Maybe monthly insurance is okay because you've kind of got that covered every month and it comes out. But the things that you've maybe decided to pay for yearly instead, oh, well, I forgot that now March has come round and my house insurance is due and it's, however much, and I don't have that currently. Or maybe you've sort of forgotten to plan for the fact that electrical items can break suddenly and inconveniently. Your fridge suddenly goes and oh, well, I kind of needed that and now I can't afford to buy a new one, or something along those lines. or things that you do need to buy sort of periodically, but it's maybe not like a monthly thing, like new clothes, for instance, clothes for specific events. So yeah, again, those kind of weddings and job interviews and things where you might need a specific outfit for a one-off. And yeah, you don't have the budget to pay for that because it's not something you're normally thinking about and normally factoring in. Okay, planning and following journeys. So, do you need to confirm with someone that you have the right building or address or place or wherever before going somewhere? Um, and if you don't do that or you haven't done that in the past, have you ever gone to the wrong place? I know that I have ended up at a dentist appointment in a dentist I was not registered at, and they were like, "What? Who are you?" Turns out I was kind of a couple of buildings down in a totally different place. So yeah, do you kind of struggle with that kind of stuff at times? Do you need additional information before you can actually go somewhere new? For instance, I hate driving somewhere new if I don't know exactly what the parking situation is going to be when I get there. I panic. I really start to panic if I arrive and then realize there is no car park for this place, or oh, there's a car park, but it's completely chock-a-block full, and I'm never going to get a space. Or I realize that there's on-street parking, but I needed an app in order to pay for that on-street parking that I don't have. And as I mentioned a moment ago, hate apps. So having to download one when I'm sort of stressed and figure out how to use it is not always going to go very well for me. So I need all of that information before I go somewhere, which can mean that I need to ask people who have already been to that place before. It can mean that I have to study Google Maps ahead of going somewhere. It can mean that I have to troll through the website of the new place that I'm going to see if they have information on what the parking situation is like. It might be instead information about toilets, do you always need to know where the toilet is when you're going somewhere new, and how accessible it is, and whether or not you're going to be able to sort of run there at a moment's notice? So yeah, is there information that you always need ahead of time before you're going to a new place? Do you need someone to take you to a new place actually before you're able to even go there yourself? Whether that means them driving you there first, whether that means that, you need to drive there first, but with somebody else in the car who knows the place. Do you always go there ahead of time the night before, in person, or, on Google Maps or something like that? Do you feel compelled to always take lots of things with you just in case? That might seem kind of excessive to other people. I for a while as a teenager, I always had with me aspirin. It's never been a painkiller I've actually used myself particularly, but I had read that if somebody is having a heart attack, then you should give them some aspirin whilst you're waiting for the ambulance to get there, because it's a blood thinner. It can help whilst you're sort of waiting for medical help. And so I decided that that meant I always needed to have aspirin on me at all times. And yeah, I always did. I always took aspirin with me anywhere, just in case I came across somebody having a heart attack, which probably seemed rather excessive to my teenage friends. I don't even know if I admitted that to them, to be honest. But yeah, I'm often one of these people. I kind of need everything but the kitchen sink, and maybe the kitchen sink as well, because you never know, might come in handy when I go places. So yeah, do you always have a big massive backpack full of stuff that you have to take with you? Do you need to factor that into going to places? If you don't drive and you're cycling everywhere and you have to be taking this massive backpack full of stuff, obviously that's going to affect you. That's going to affect all kinds of aspects in terms of how long it's going to take you to cycle there, in terms of whether you're going to have kind of aches and pains later from carrying that around, things like this as well. But also the mental drain of planning for it all and having to get it all together, and some of the anxiety involved, and things like that. Do you use aids like your sat nav and Google Maps and things, I have that up even when I'm going to places I've been to before. I really need to have been somewhere many, many, many times before I feel confident going there without having it up on a screen for me to follow, because there might be diversions. And diversions can cause me meltdowns, and they're not always well signposted. So I've learned through experience that I really should just have it up every single time. Do you need to take sensory tools or comfort items with you when you go places? Do you need earplugs? Do you need ear defenders, sunglasses, fidget toys? Do you need to take your, little kind of some nice little comfort toys that you can squish and hug and things to keep you regulated whilst you're out and about? So what sorts of aids do you take with you as well? And do you ever have meltdowns because of, last minute roadworks that you hadn't expected that didn't show up on your sat nav, things like that? Again, you can actually think about specific examples and pop in one or two as well to help illustrate your point with questions like this. Okay, and lastly, last one we're doing today is moving around. Now, generally speaking, just autism alone, if you're autistic and there are no other kind of co-occurring things going on, you're probably not going to fill in this section. Typically, autism alone won't mean that you'll need to, but do consider whether being autistic has an influence on conditions that do affect your mobility. Think about whether or not your proprioceptive and vestibular differences or your executive functioning challenges or things actually interact with some kind of mobility issue that you do have, or some kind of condition that you've got that does affect your mobility, because that will be one way in which potentially being autistic could be really relevant to this question. Okay, so I hope that's given you a bit of an overview there. I hope that that's made it a bit clearer what you can and can't kind of say when you're filling in the ADP form for being autistic. I think a lot of the time, because we do underplay the things that we're doing to support ourselves because of that masking, because we've maybe had people in our lives around us tell us, oh no, that's not a big deal, no, it's not noisy in here, you're fine, you're fine. That can make it really difficult for us sometimes to actually recognize when we are doing extra things, when we are having to put in extra effort compared to other people, when it's taking us longer to do things. And sometimes that means that we really downplay some of our struggles, and the ways in which we might actually be quite disabled. So it is okay to fill in the ADP form because you're autistic, and that being your primary reason for filling it in doesn't mean that you'll necessarily get it, that you will be successful. But if you do, think about all those things I've said for each section. That should hopefully mean that at least they're getting a really accurate view of your life, of the sorts of things that you're having to put into place for yourself in your day-to-day life. Okay, so thank you so much for listening. I really hope that this has been helpful for some of you as well. And if you do think that it's been quite useful for you, please consider liking, commenting, subscribing, all of that. You know what to do. Thanks a lot.